Our second lesson this morning comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the many tragedies of Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast just over 10 years ago, was that it displaced thousands of people from the worst hit neighborhoods of New Orleans. Many of these people had lived in their neighborhoods, and many of them in their houses, for decades, for multiple generations, and most of them lived in poverty. Suddenly, after Katrina, they were forced to relocate, to go somewhere else, Baton Rouge, Lafayette, Houston, and start over. It was a tragedy, but for many, it was also the fresh start they didn't know they needed. Studies have shown that for most people, but especially people who live in poverty, moving out of your neighborhood completely, not just to a different home around the block, but to a whole new place with new people and new opportunities, can dramatically increase your quality of life. This is in part because moving to a new place changes so many different factors: your job, your income, your neighborhood, your community, your health, or your access to health care. An event like Katrina, as much as we all wish it hadn't happened, and as much trauma and grief and destruction as it caused, turned out for some to be the opportunity of a lifetime. Moving away from family, friends, a familiar culture, and a sense of place and belonging is a huge undertaking. Trading the known for the unknown is an enormous risk. To leave a place we know and love usually requires either the destruction of everything we've known, so that staying where we are is no longer an option, or the promise of something so compelling on the other side of the journey that we are willing to take the risk. This fall, we are exploring core stories of the Bible, stories that set up the major themes of God's relationship with humanity. We begin with the story of God's call, a story in which God calls one man and one family to risk everything they know and everything they have to follow God into an uncertain future. Now, technically, this isn't the first call story in the Bible. As Walter Brueggemann points out, the first call story is Genesis 1, when God calls the world into being with a word. That story is huge. It is cinematic. Light and dark, land and sea, the creation of every animal and creature. Going from that call to the call of Abraham is a bit like the opening scene from The Sound of Music, where panoramic views of the majestic Austrian mountains gradually focus in on an isolated meadow and one small person in the middle of it, spinning and singing. The hills are alive. It's a bit like that with Abraham. The creation of the universe and everything in it in the first few chapters of Genesis is followed by an epic flood, and then in chapter 11, lots of procreation of God's creatures. Lots of new generations being born. This father begets that son, and that son begets another one until Terah has his son Abraham, and Abraham marries Sarah, and then all those new generations just stop. Genesis chapter 11, verse 30, now Sarah was barren. She had no child. With that one sentence, the story of God's people comes to a screeching halt until God calls Abraham. One of the things we might notice about God's call is it contains an alarming lack of detail about exactly where Abraham is supposed to go and exactly how these three promises of land and offspring and blessing will be fulfilled. Go to the land that I will show you, is all God says. And yet Abraham went. In a conversation about this story, the late pastor and theologian Lewis Smedes once said, I can imagine Sarah waking up about 4 a.m, hearing the bustling noises of Abraham packing. And Sarah says, what are you doing, Abe? Packing. What for? Well, we're leaving. Where are we going? I don't know. Why are we going? Because he told me to. Who's he? He didn't tell me. Smedes goes on to say, and then I can imagine Sarah calling her father, what am I going to do? And her father says, I knew you shouldn't have married that nut. It's a little crazy. It's more than a little crazy to hear the voice of what was then an unknown God, to hear these absurd promises, and then to do what this God says. It begs the question, why? Why would Abraham and Sarah go? In his letter to the Hebrews, the Apostle Paul answers the why question with one word: faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going, Paul writes. Well, okay, faith surely had something to do with it. But sometimes I worry that when we read this story and attribute Abraham's response to his faith, we put him up on a pedestal. We make him a person totally unlike us, with faith in some measure that we don't and could never have, and in so doing, we let ourselves off the hook, thinking God would never call us the way God called Abraham, and even if God did call us, we just wouldn't have the faith we needed to respond. But I don't think Abraham was more than human, and I don't think he had any more faith than you or me. Abraham did have two things going for him, though: experience and desperation. At the end of Genesis chapter 11, just before today's passage, Abraham's father takes Abraham and his wife, Sarah, away from their home in a town called Ur to a new place, a town called Haran. In other words, this desire to travel, this willingness to go from known to unknown, appears to run in the family. Now, risk-taking is hard at any age. We would always rather stick with what we know than venture into unknown territory. But risk-taking becomes just a little bit easier if we can look to someone else, someone we know and trust, and remember that they did it too. We've seen this play out in the current refugee crisis, but it is a common theme among all such crises. People are willing to take a huge risk to get to a better life somewhere else, often because they've seen someone else do it before them. Crossing seas in little more than life rafts, risking their lives and the lives of their children, spending their life savings to escape violence and destruction at home and get to a place where they might have a better life. The more people who make that journey, the more people who are inspired to make that journey too. We are more likely to take risks when we see someone who's done it before us. So Abraham had the example of his father moving from one place to another. But that's not all. Because we also know that risk-taking becomes easier when we are desperate. Surely what compelled Abraham and Sarah to pack up and go wasn't just the memory of having done so before. This time there was something more. And that something was God's promise that they, at 75 years of age, would have children. That against all odds, they would yet become parents. And not just the parents of one child, but the parents of an entire nation. God calls this old, barren, set in their ways couple who were sure they had seen all life had to offer them. God calls and tells them their story is not over yet. This is the way of God. Throughout the Bible, we see that God's call almost always comes into situations that appear hopeless, barren, and God promises something so imaginable it seems absurd, laughable even. It is no coincidence that when Abraham and Sarah finally have a son, they name him Isaac, the Hebrew word for laughter. Again and again, in story after story, God calls the most unlikely people to live into the most implausible promises, which means that when God calls us, God speaks right to the situations in our lives which are bereft of hope, and promises that there, even there, something new and different can be born. The relationship that once meant everything, but now causes only pain. The addiction that consumes every waking thought and threatens everything we have worked for. The illness, our own or another, that forces us to face the reality of death. The transition to a new job or to no job. The reality that what we thought we were going to study or do with our lives professionally turns out not to be such a good fit after all. The day-to-day struggle of raising children. The pain of not having children. God calls and God promises precisely into those situations where we have given up hope of a resolution or a fresh start. God speaks to our deepest pain and desperation because God's call comes to us out of God's unconditional, abiding love for us. God does not call us because of who we are. God calls because of who God is. God loves us, God claims us, and God does not wait for us to be ready or to have it all together to call us. God calls us exactly as we are because God longs to help us write the next chapter of our stories. When they first met, Lois and Maggie were members of a small Native American reservation where nearly everyone older than the age of 12 consumed alcohol regularly. Once a week, Maggie would go the few miles to Lois's home to babysit for her kids. After about 2 months, Maggie started wondering what was Lois doing every Tuesday night on their quiet reservation. So one evening, after Lois left, Maggie packed up the kids and went to find out. When Maggie arrived at the lodge, she and the kids looked in the window and saw a big circle of chairs with Lois sitting in a chair all by herself. Not one other chair in the circle had a person in it. When Lois got home, Maggie asked her, "What are you doing every Tuesday night?" Lois responded, "I've been holding AA meetings." Maggie was confused. What do you mean you're holding meetings? I went there and looked through the window. We watched you sitting in that circle of chairs. You were all alone. I wasn't alone, Lois said. I was there with the spirits and the ancestors, and one day the people will come. And she was right. It took a while, but 10 years later, that room was filled with people every Tuesday night coming to AA meetings, and the community began to turn around. Into our places of pain and hopelessness and desperation, God does not wave a magic wand or send us an extraordinary TED Talk or give us a miracle drug to solve our problems. God calls and God promises. God does not call extraordinary people. God does not seek out those who have nothing to lose or who, by some genetic accident, have a greater measure of faith than the rest of us. God calls ordinary, broken people. God calls us. God speaks to our pain and loss and promises new life. God calls us to take part in God's favorite story, the one where in the midst of what looks like a dead end, God creates with us a new beginning. Amen.